The night the rain didn't leave. The rain had a way of changing Lo's angels when it came down slowly, without warning, washing the city into something quieter and more honest. Streetlights blurred into soft halos, the noise softened, and the world felt smaller, almost private. On a night like that, when most people hurried indoors, Keanu Reeves stood still beneath the open sky, letting the rain soak through his coat as if he had nowhere else he needed to be. He wasn't lost. He wasn't waiting for a car or shelter. He was waiting because he had said he would. The corner where he stood was unremarkable to anyone passing by, an old bookstore tucked between a closed cafe and a dimly lit art gallery, its windows fogged, its signs slightly crooked. But to Keanu, this place carried a quiet gravity. Years ago, long before rumors and headlines had rewritten their names into something larger than human, this was where he had first crossed paths with Sandra Bullock by accident. No cameras, no scripts, just two people laughing at the same misplaced book. That memory was why he stayed. Rain slid down his hair, down his face, tracing lines that might have looked like tears if anyone had been close enough to notice. His hands were buried in his pockets, shoulders relaxed, expression calm in that familiar way that suggested patience rather than resignation. To the outside world, it was just a man standing alone in bad weather. To Keanu, it was something much deeper. It was about keeping a promise made quietly without witnesses during a moment when promises mattered more than words. Months earlier, Sandra's life had looked perfect from the outside. Interviews, premieres, applause, the familiar rhythm of success repeating itself like a well-rehearsed song. But perfection, when stretched too thin, can begin to feel hollow. The smiles became careful. The laughter came half a second too late. The pauses between sentences grew longer. Most people didn't notice the difference. Keanu did. He always noticed the spaces where people hid their tiredness. It had been after a small dinner, nothing extravagant, just a few familiar faces and polite conversation. When the night ended, he walked Sandra to her car beneath flickering streetlights. She joked, thanked everyone, waved goodbye, and then fell quiet as she reached for her keys. Keanu had watched her hands shake just slightly, the way people do when they're trying very hard to seem normal. "You okay?" he asked gently, not pushing, not demanding an answer. She smiled too quickly. "Yeah, just tired." He nodded, accepting the words without believing them. He never argued with silence. He simply made space for it. Weeks passed. Their schedules pulled them in different directions, the way the industry always does, loud and impatient. But something stayed with him, that quiet tremor in her voice, that look that said she was holding herself together rather than standing strong. One night, after too much thinking and not enough sleep, he sent her a message. Nothing dramatic, just, "Hey, checking in. How are you really doing?" She didn't reply for 2 days. When she finally did, it wasn't a text. It was a voice note, barely a minute long, but it felt heavier than any conversation they'd ever had. Her voice cracked halfway through. She spoke about exhaustion, about feeling like she was disappearing inside the expectations placed on her, about how success sometimes felt lonelier than failure. Keanu listened without interrupting, replaying it again and again, letting the words settle instead of rushing to fix them. When he replied, his message was simple. "You don't need answers tonight. Just breathe. Tomorrow, if you want, meet me at the bookstore. No pressure." She responded with a small heart, nothing else. The next morning, the sky darkened early, clouds rolling in like they had planned it. Keanu arrived at the bookstore before opening time, 2 coffees in his hands, an umbrella resting against his leg. He waited. Minutes passed, then an hour, then another. The rain began slowly, tapping at first, then pouring with intention. She didn't come. Anyone else might have left, assumed plans had changed, pride stung just enough to justify walking away. Keanu stayed, not because he expected her to arrive, but because being present mattered more than being seen. When you tell someone you'll be there, sometimes that means staying even when you're alone. Across the city, Sandra sat by her apartment window, watching the same rain streak across the glass. She saw his message again, "I'm here, take your time." Guilt tangled with fear inside her chest. She wanted to go, she wanted to talk. But the thought of being seen like this, unsteady, uncertain, made her freeze. She didn't want to be anything less than composed in front of someone who had always treated her with such quiet respect. Then memory did what courage couldn't. She remembered a different rainy day years ago, a set soaked with water, her slipping and laughing, Keanu handing her his coat without comment, without drama. Just kindness. Simple, human, that memory cracked something open. She grabbed her umbrella and ran. By the time she reached the corner, the rain had soaked through everything. And there he was, still waiting, the coffee's cold, his coat heavy with water. When their eyes met, neither spoke at first. The city seemed to hold its breath. "You waited," she finally whispered. He smiled, soft and unassuming. "I said I would." "You didn't have to," she said, voice trembling. "Maybe not," he replied quietly, "but sometimes showing up matters more than being asked." The words undid her. She dropped her umbrella, rain soaking them both, and for a moment the world disappeared. No explanations, no apologies, just two people standing still, letting the rain wash away what they couldn't say. That night changed something, not loudly, not dramatically. It shifted things the way tides do, slow, undeniable, permanent. They began meeting more often after that, not as actors or public figures, but as people reclaiming pieces of themselves. Coffee without schedules, walks without phones, conversations where silence wasn't something to escape. People noticed Sandra's smile returning, this time unforced. They noticed her eyes again, alive and present. Keanu stayed in the background, as always, uninterested in attention, content with the knowledge that he had kept his word. But beneath the calm, something waited, something unspoken, fragile, and powerful. And neither of them knew yet that the reason Keanu had stood in the rain that night went far deeper than friendship. A reason that, when finally revealed, would leave everyone who heard it unable to look at love the same way again. The weight of quiet truths. After the rain-soaked evening at the bookstore, life did not suddenly transform into something loud or cinematic, and that was precisely what made the change feel real. Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock did not speak about what had happened in any dramatic sense. They didn't analyze it, label it, or turn it into a moment bigger than it needed to be. Instead, the experience settled between them like a shared breath, something understood rather than explained. They continued living their separate lives, yet something invisible now connected them, pulling gently, steadily, with no urgency but no retreat either. Sandra found herself waking earlier in the mornings, not because her schedule demanded it, but because her mind felt quieter. The heaviness that had once pressed against her chest like an unspoken obligation began to ease, replaced by a cautious calm. She still faced the cameras, still answered questions she'd answered 100 times before, but inside, she was no longer performing just to survive the day. There was now a sense that someone knew her beyond the polished responses, someone who had seen her standing still in the rain and hadn't turned away. That knowledge alone made her shoulders feel lighter. Keanu, on the other hand, carried the night differently. While Sandra felt relief, he felt responsibility, not the kind that suffocates, but the kind that anchors. He had always believed that words were less important than actions, and that belief guided him now more than ever. He didn't call her constantly, didn't hover, didn't intrude on her space. He simply showed up when it felt right, offering companionship without demand. Sometimes it was a short walk, sometimes a quiet meal, sometimes nothing more than sitting together while the world continued outside, loud and impatient. There were evenings when they talked about nothing of importance at all, and those were the moments Keanu valued most. Sandra would ramble about a book she'd just finished, pausing mid-sentence to reflect, while he listened with the same attention most people reserved for speeches or confessions. He never rushed her thoughts. He never interrupted the silences when they appeared. He understood that silence, when shared, could be a language of its own. For Sandra, this was new. She had spent years surrounded by people who needed something from her, even when they were kind. With Keanu, there was no transaction. His presence didn't ask her to be more or less than she already was. But the world, as it always does, began to notice. It started quietly, almost harmlessly. A blurry photo of them walking together surfaced online, taken from a distance, nothing intimate, nothing scandalous. Then another appeared, this one of them leaving a small cafe, both smiling faintly, both unaware they were being watched. Headlines followed, careful at first, speculative rather than accusatory. Words like reunion, rekindled, and long-rumored connection crept into articles, reshaping moments of simple companionship into something louder than the truth. Sandra tried not to let it bother her. She told herself she had survived worse, that rumors were part of the world she lived in, a tax paid for visibility. Still, something about this felt different. This wasn't a red carpet pairing or a promotional narrative. This was personal, and the intrusion stung more sharply because of that. She worried not for herself, but for Keanu. She knew how deeply he valued privacy, how carefully he guarded the quiet corners of his life. The thought that she might be the reason that peace was being threatened made her chest tighten with guilt. One evening, as the city glowed beneath a soft dusk, she finally voiced what had been weighing on her. They were sitting on a small balcony, the air cool, the sound of distant traffic muted. She held her mug with both hands, staring into the steam rather than at him. She told him she was sorry, that she hadn't meant for any of this attention to follow them, that she understood if he needed distance. Her words came out carefully, measured, shaped by years of learning how to protect others from discomfort. Keanu listened, as he always did, without reacting immediately. When she finished, he leaned back slightly, eyes thoughtful, expression calm. He told her that the noise didn't frighten him as much as people assumed. What unsettled him was not the attention, but the idea of letting fear dictate how he showed up for someone who mattered. He explained that he had spent much of his life watching good things slip away because he had mistaken silence for safety. This time, he didn't want to make the same choice. His honesty surprised her, not because it was dramatic, but because it was rare. He wasn't confessing love or making promises. He was admitting vulnerability, something far quieter and far braver. Sandra felt tears press behind her eyes, not from sadness, but from the relief of being trusted with that truth. In that moment, she understood that what they were building wasn't fragile despite the outside noise. It was steady because it wasn't rushed. Still, the headlines grew louder before they faded. Strangers dissected their expressions, their body language, the pauses between their steps. Friends asked gentle questions masked as concern. Sandra answered politely, deflecting when she could, protecting what felt sacred without making it secret. Keanu remained unchanged, calm in public, kind in private, refusing to let the world's curiosity shape his behavior. But inside, something stirred that he hadn't yet shared with her. Late at night, when the city finally slept, Keanu found himself revisiting memories he had long set aside. Loss had been a recurring presence in his life, arriving without warning, leaving him cautious about attachment. He had learned to love quietly, carefully, always prepared for the possibility that what he cherished could disappear. Standing in the rain for Sandra had not been an impulsive act. It had been a decision born from years of restraint finally giving way to sincerity. He wrote when he couldn't sleep, not scripts or notes, but letters he never sent, words that lived only on paper and in his mind. One of those letters was addressed to Sandra, though he never intended for her to read it. In it, he spoke about admiration rather than desire, about respect rather than possession. He wrote about how rare it was to meet someone whose strength came from kindness rather than armor, and how waiting in the rain hadn't felt like sacrifice at all, but like alignment. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and placed it away, believing some truths were meant to exist without being spoken. Sandra, unaware of the letter, sensed the depth of his presence even without words. She felt it in the way he remembered small details, in the way he noticed when she grew quiet and didn't demand explanation. She felt it in the absence of pressure, in the freedom to simply be tired or uncertain without being fixed. Gradually, she began to realize that what she had been missing for so long wasn't ambition or validation, but permission to exist without performance. Yet just as comfort began to settle, the world shifted again, preparing to test what they were quietly building. A single message, delayed and unexpected, would soon surface, revealing that the rain Keanu had waded through was not just a moment of compassion, but the beginning of a promise rooted far deeper than either of them had fully understood. What silence carries when words are afraid. As the days stretched forward, the calm between Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock did not fade, but it did deepen in ways that neither of them openly acknowledged. It was no longer just about shared moments or quiet companionship. It was about the subtle shift that happens when two people begin to recognize that their presence in each other's lives is no longer accidental. Sandra felt it in the way she reached for her phone during small, ordinary moments, not to call anyone in particular, but because she sensed that Keanu would understand whatever she was feeling without her needing to explain it. Keanu felt it in the way his thoughts kept circling back to her during the most unexpected times, like when he was alone at night or driving familiar roads that suddenly felt different, as though they were leading somewhere new. Sandra had spent most of her adult life mastering the art of composure. She knew how to stand tall when the world expected strength, and how to smile when vulnerability would have been easier. But lately, cracks had begun to appear in that carefully built armor, not because she was breaking, but because she was finally allowing herself to rest. With Keanu, she didn't feel the need to be impressive or inspiring. She could simply be present, and that presence felt like a kind of safety she hadn't known she was missing. Yet, safety can be frightening when you've grown used to standing alone. Sometimes, the quiet that brings peace also invites questions you've avoided for years. One afternoon, while driving home from a long shoot, Sandra found herself overwhelmed by an emotion she couldn't immediately name. The city blurred past her windows, sunlight reflecting off glass buildings, and suddenly she felt the familiar weight return, not as heavy as before, but persistent. It was the realization that healing doesn't erase fear. It simply makes you brave enough to face it. She pulled over, sat in the stillness of her car, and allowed herself to breathe. In that moment, she didn't call a manager or a friend. She called Keanu, not because she needed advice, but because she needed honesty. When he answered, his voice was calm, grounded, as if he had been expecting the call. She didn't launch into a story or a confession. She simply told him that she was tired again, that some days the quiet helped and other days it made her wonder what she was avoiding. Keanu listened without interruption, letting her words arrive at their own pace. When she finished, there was a pause long enough that most people would have rushed to fill it. He didn't. Instead, he told her something simple and unexpected. That strength wasn't about never feeling lost, but about choosing not to pretend when you were. That sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was admit they didn't have all the answers yet. Those words stayed with her long after the call ended. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table, notebook open, pen hovering above the page. She began writing again, not scripts or notes for work, but thoughts she had buried for years. She wrote about pressure, about loneliness disguised as independence, about the strange relief of being seen by someone who didn't ask her to perform. She didn't write Keanu's name, but every sentence carried his presence. Writing, once a task, now felt like release. Meanwhile, Keanu was grappling with his own unease. The connection between them was no longer something he could dismiss as coincidence or kindness. It was becoming a choice, and choices carried risk. He had learned through loss and experience that attachment could be painful, and he had built his life carefully to avoid unnecessary suffering. Yet standing in the rain for Sandra had already broken one of his long-held rules. He hadn't planned it, but he also hadn't resisted it. That realization unsettled him more than the attention or the rumors ever could. Late one night, unable to sleep, he took a walk through his quiet neighborhood. The air was cool, the streets nearly empty, and the silence felt heavier than usual. He thought about all the times he had shown up for others without asking anything in return, believing that distance protected both sides. With Sandra, distance no longer felt like protection. It felt like avoidance. He wondered if his instinct to shield her from his own feelings was truly selfless, or if it was fear wearing the mask of restraint. The next time they met, something was different. It wasn't visible in their gestures or their expressions, but it was there in the pauses, in the way their conversations brushed against deeper truths without fully landing. They talked about work, about books, about ordinary things, yet beneath it all ran a current of unspoken understanding. Sandra noticed it too, the way his gaze lingered slightly longer, the way he seemed to be weighing something he hadn't yet decided to share. She didn't push him. She had learned through her own healing that timing mattered. Instead, she focused on being present, offering the same patience he had given her. One evening, as they sat together watching the city lights flicker on below, she told him that she was grateful, not for the rain, not for the waiting, but for the fact that he had treated her pain with respect rather than curiosity, that he had never tried to turn her struggle into a story or a lesson. He simply nodded, absorbing her words quietly, feeling their weight settle in his chest. What neither of them knew yet was that the silence between them was carrying something fragile and powerful, something that could no longer remain unspoken forever. Soon, circumstances beyond their control would force truths into the open, testing whether what they shared could survive not just quiet understanding, but the vulnerability of being fully seen. The rain had brought them together, but it was the courage to speak or not speak that would decide what came next. The day the world pressed too close. Time moved forward quietly, but the outside world rarely respected quiet for long, especially when two familiar names were involved. For Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock, the calm they had built together began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a fragile glass room surrounded by noise. It wasn't that anything between them had broken. It was that the world had started leaning in, pressing its face against the windows, trying to see what wasn't meant to be displayed. Sandra felt it first, the shift in energy when she walked into meetings or stepped onto sets. The way conversations paused just a second too long, the way people studied her expressions as if searching for clues she hadn't agreed to give. She had lived with attention her entire career, but this was different. This wasn't about a role or a premiere. It was about her inner life, the parts of her that were finally healing after years of being quietly strained. She worried that the constant speculation would undo the fragile balance she had just begun to reclaim. More than that, she worried about Keanu, who had always moved through the world with humility, who had built his life around avoiding exactly this kind of intrusion. She wondered if her presence was slowly pulling him back into a spotlight he had carefully stepped away from. One afternoon, after a particularly exhausting round of interviews that danced too close to personal territory, Sandra drove without direction, letting the city pass by until she found herself parked near the ocean. The waves rolled in with steady patience, indifferent to fame, gossip, or expectation. She sat there for a long time, watching the horizon, thinking about how much energy it took to constantly guard one's truth. Eventually, she called Keanu, not with panic, but with a heaviness she could no longer ignore. When he arrived, he didn't bring answers or reassurance. He brought presence. They walked along the shoreline without hurry, shoes sinking into wet sand, the sound of water filling the spaces between their thoughts. Sandra spoke honestly, not dramatically, but with the quiet exhaustion of someone who had spent too long carrying responsibility alone. She told him she was afraid that the attention would grow sharper, that it would demand explanations neither of them owed. She admitted she didn't know how to protect what they were building without hiding, and hiding was something she was tired of doing. Keanu listened, hands tucked into his jacket, gaze steady on the moving water. When she finished, he stopped walking and turned to her, his expression thoughtful, not guarded. He told her that he had spent much of his life believing that privacy meant isolation, that keeping things unspoken was the same as keeping them safe. But standing in the rain for her had changed something fundamental in him. It had shown him that presence, even when visible, could still be honest and controlled. He said that the world's curiosity didn't scare him as much as the idea of letting fear decide how he treated someone he cared about. His words didn't solve the problem, but they reframed it. Sandra felt something settle inside her, not certainty, but clarity. She realized that what she was afraid of wasn't exposure. It was losing the sense of agency she had just begun to rebuild. With Keanu, she wasn't being pulled into something loud. She was being invited into something steady. That difference mattered more than the noise outside. Still, the pressure continued to mount. Photos appeared more frequently, headlines grew bolder, and the tone shifted from curiosity to assumption. Industry insiders whispered. Fans speculated. Every shared moment was interpreted, edited, repackaged. Sandra tried to ignore it, but the constant hum wore her down. One evening, after a particularly intrusive article crossed a line she hadn't expected, she sat alone in her living room, lights dim, phone face down on the table. The quiet that once felt healing now felt heavy again. Keanu arrived without warning, not because she had called him, but because he had sensed the shift. He didn't ask what had happened. He simply sat beside her, their shoulders barely touching, and waited. Eventually, she spoke, her voice low and tired, telling him that she was afraid of becoming a version of herself she didn't recognize again, shaped by reaction rather than intention. She confessed that part of her wondered if stepping back, creating distance, might be easier for both of them. The words hung between them, fragile and sharp. Keanu didn't respond immediately. He looked at her, really looked, as if weighing something deeply personal. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. He told her that distance might reduce noise, but it wouldn't protect what mattered. That avoiding something meaningful because it was difficult would only teach fear that it had power. He admitted that he didn't have a plan, that he couldn't promise the world would suddenly become respectful or quiet, but he could promise that he wouldn't disappear just because things got complicated. Sandra felt tears rise, not from sadness, but from the relief of being met with honesty rather than retreat. She realized that what she had been searching for wasn't certainty or control, but partnership in its truest sense. Not someone to shield her from the world, but someone willing to stand beside her while facing it. In that moment, the connection between them shifted again, becoming less tentative, more intentional, though still unnamed. Yet even as they found their footing, something unseen was already moving beneath the surface. The attention surrounding them wasn't entirely accidental. Subtle patterns began to emerge, hints that not all of the scrutiny was driven by public curiosity alone. Someone somewhere was watching more closely than they should have been, waiting for the right moment to turn observation into leverage. Neither Keanu nor Sandra sensed it yet, but the quiet they were fighting to protect was about to be tested in ways neither had prepared for. When waiting becomes a choice, the tension that had been quietly gathering around Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock did not announce itself with drama or confrontation. It arrived the way storms often do, subtle at first, pressing gently against the edges of ordinary days until even the smallest moments felt heavier than they should. Sandra noticed it in the way her phone buzzed more frequently, in the way conversations with colleagues drifted toward assumptions rather than questions. and in the way her own thoughts kept circling back to a single worry she didn't know how to name. It wasn't fear of the public or exhaustion from work. It was the realization that what she shared with Keanu was no longer something that could exist untouched by the world, and that frightened her in ways she hadn't expected. Keanu felt it too, though he carried it differently. For him, the weight came not from the noise itself, but from the responsibility of choosing how to respond to it. He had spent years perfecting the art of stepping aside, of letting attention pass without resistance, believing that distance was the kindest solution for everyone involved. But this time, distance felt like betrayal, not to Sandra, but to himself. He had waited in the rain because he believed some moments deserved presence, not avoidance, and now that belief was being tested every day. One evening, after a long stretch of silence between them that felt heavier than any argument, Keanu invited Sandra to take a drive with him. There was no destination, no schedule, just the quiet comfort of movement. The city lights blurred past as they drove, the hum of the road filling the space where words hesitated. Sandra watched the reflection of passing lights in the window, gathering her thoughts carefully, aware that whatever she said next might change the shape of what they were becoming. She spoke first, not with accusation, but with honesty that trembled just slightly beneath her calm exterior. She told him that she was scared, not of the world's curiosity, but of losing the peace she had only just begun to find. She admitted that some days she wondered whether love, even the quiet kind, always came with a cost she wasn't sure she could afford again. The vulnerability in her voice surprised even her. She had grown used to guarding her doubts as carefully as her public image. Keanu listened without interruption, hands steady on the steering wheel, eyes forward. When she finished, he pulled the car over and turned to face her fully, giving her his complete attention in that way that always made her feel seen rather than studied. He told her that waiting had never been about endurance for him. It had always been about choice. He explained that standing in the rain wasn't an act of patience alone, but a decision to remain present even when it would have been easier to walk away. He admitted that he was afraid too, not of headlines or speculation, but of repeating old patterns where fear disguised itself as wisdom. His words shifted something in her. Sandra realized that what frightened her most wasn't the possibility of pain, but the idea of retreating into isolation again, of convincing herself that independence meant never leaning on anyone. She had spent years proving her strength to the world. Perhaps now she needed to learn how to be strong in a different way. Sitting there beside him, she understood that what they shared wasn't something fragile waiting to break, but something deliberate, shaped by choice rather than impulse. In the days that followed, they became more intentional about how they spent their time together. They didn't make grand declarations or public statements, but they also didn't hide. They met in ordinary places, lived ordinary moments, and let the world see what it would without explanation. Sandra felt a quiet confidence returning, not the performative kind demanded by her career, but the grounded certainty of someone who knew where she stood. Keanu, too, felt a shift, as if a long-held tension in his chest had finally eased, replaced by a steadiness he hadn't realized he'd been missing. Yet beneath this growing resolve, something else was unfolding. Subtle signs appeared that the attention surrounding them wasn't entirely organic. Certain details in articles felt too specific, too informed, as though someone with access to their private rhythms was feeding the narrative. Keanu sensed it first, a familiar instinct honed by years of navigating fame. He didn't mention it immediately, not wanting to add to Sandra's burden, but the awareness lingered, sharp and unsettling. The truth would soon surface, revealing that the rain he had waded through, the patience he had practiced, and the choices they were now making together were about to be tested in a far more personal way than either of them anticipated. Waiting, he would soon realize, was not just about standing still. It was about deciding, again and again, to stay when walking away seemed safer. And that decision, once made, would change everything that followed. The reason that left the world in tears. The truth, when it finally arrived, did not come wrapped in scandal or shouted through headlines. It arrived quietly, the way the most meaningful things often do, carrying a weight that could only be understood once it was fully seen. For Keanu Reeves, the moment of revelation had been building for years, shaped by loss, restraint, and a deep belief that love was something you proved through presence rather than promises. For Sandra Bullock, the truth arrived like a soft ache, opening her eyes to something she had sensed but never fully grasped, something that would change how she understood not only him, but the night he had stood waiting in the rain. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that carries no warning of what it will become. Sandra was at Keanu's place, sitting near the bookshelf where old novels and worn scripts lived side by side, the air filled with quiet familiarity. Outside, clouds gathered again, gray and slow, as if the sky itself remembered what rain had once meant for them. Keanu had stepped out briefly, leaving her alone with the stillness, trusting her in a way that felt natural now. As she wandered, her fingers traced spines of books, pausing at one that felt strangely deliberate, tucked slightly out of alignment, as though it had been returned with care rather than habit. She opened it without intention, letting the pages fall where they would, and that was when she saw it. A folded letter, aged slightly at the edges, resting between pages marked by a passage about patience and seeing with the heart. Her name was written on the front in handwriting she knew well. For a moment, she hesitated, aware that some truths, once uncovered, could not be placed back where they were found. But something inside her urged her forward, a quiet certainty that whatever waited inside those pages was already part of her story. She read slowly, absorbing each line not as a confession of romance, but as a testament of devotion far deeper than words like love could easily capture. Keanu had written about waiting not as sacrifice, but as respect, about believing that some people deserved time without pressure, space without abandonment. He wrote about watching her carry the weight of expectation with grace, about admiring her strength precisely because she allowed herself to feel, and about standing in the rain that night not because he expected anything in return, but because he knew what it meant to be alone when the world assumed you were fine. The final lines spoke of a promise he had never spoken aloud, a promise to never turn away when she needed someone to simply stay. By the time she finished reading, tears blurred the words on the page, not tears of sadness but of recognition. She understood then that the rain had never been the point, the waiting had been. Keanu had not stood there out of hope for something more, nor out of obligation or longing for acknowledgement. He had waited because he had once made a vow to himself, shaped by losses that had taught him how fleeting connection could be. He had promised that if he ever recognized a moment where presence mattered more than comfort, he would choose presence, no matter how quiet or unseen it was. When he returned, he found her standing there, the letter still in her hands, her expression soft and overwhelmed. He didn't ask if she had read it. He knew. The silence between them carried everything words could not. Sandra stepped toward him, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it, and told him that no one had ever chosen her so gently, so completely, without asking her to become anything else in return. She told him that the reason he had waited in the rain was not just something that moved her. It was something that restored her faith in what love could look like when stripped of performance and expectation. Keanu listened, eyes lowered, not out of shame, but humility. He told her that he had never intended for the letter to be found, because he believed some truths were meant to guide actions, not conversations. But seeing her there, understanding at last, he realized that waiting had not been about holding back. It had been about timing. About allowing two people to arrive at the same place honestly without being pushed by fear or pulled by illusion. When the story eventually reached the public, it did not spread because of gossip or spectacle. It spread because people recognized themselves in it. They saw a version of love that did not rush, did not demand, did not seek applause. They saw a man who had chosen to stand in discomfort so someone else wouldn't feel alone, and a woman who had learned that accepting that kind of presence was not weakness, but courage. Messages poured in from strangers around the world, from people who had waited for loved ones, who had shown up quietly, who had believed that kindness could still matter in a loud world. And that was the reason that left everyone in tears. Not romance framed by drama, not a headline built on fantasy, but a simple truth revealed at last, that the most powerful love stories are written not in grand gestures, but in moments where someone chooses to stay when no one is watching. As the rain finally began to fall again outside, Keanu and Sandra stood together by the window, no longer waiting, but knowing that whatever storms came next, they would meet them side by side, grounded in a promise that had already proven itself stronger than the noise of the world.